On a hard white morning in March of 1991, while half of Cimarron County, Oklahoma still pretended the farm crisis had already done its worst, a 15-year-old girl walked into a foreclosure auction with a folded blue map under her arm. Not a banker, not a lawyer, not a landman in pressed denim. A girl. Her name was Etta Sayer, and she had driven in before sunrise in a truck whose heater only worked when the road went uphill. She wore her father's brown chore coat, too big in the shoulders, shiny at the cuffs from the years another man's wrists had rubbed them. In one hand, she carried bidder card number 18. In the other, a county soil map folded so many times the creases had gone white and soft as old cloth. And in her coat pocket, wrapped in a grocery sack, she had $682. That was not enough to buy land. It was just enough to make a deposit if no one in that tent understood what they were looking at. The auctioneer took one look at the oversized coat and leaned toward his clerk. "Somebody's daughter," he said, "come to watch grown men lose money." The men laughed. Etta heard every word. She did not look at them. She walked to the back row, flattened the blue map across her knees, and began to read, because she hadn't come to watch the auction. She had come to buy the one piece of ground every man in that county had already given up for dead. And she knew something they didn't. The morning came in hard and white across the Oklahoma panhandle. The kind of cold that does not bite so much as settle, the kind that gets into the seams of a coat and stays there all day, no matter what you do. Frost lay over the wheat stubble in a thin gray crust, and the sky above Cimarron County had no color in it at all. Just a flat, pale lid stretched from one horizon to the other, the color of a tin plate left out in the weather. The wind moved low across the ground, the way it always did out there, carrying dust so fine it got between your teeth. And it carried something else that morning too, though no one in that tent could have put a name to it. A feeling. The feeling a place gets when it is about to lose something, or when something is about to be decided. Half the county still pretended the farm crisis had already done its worst. They were wrong, and most of them knew it, and the knowing sat on them like the cold. A girl drove into that morning in a 1978 pickup with a heater that only worked when the road climbed a hill. She came in before the sun was fully up, the headlights cutting two weak cones through the blue dark, the truck rattling over the cattle guard south of the old Harlow place, 13 miles below the town of Hartwell. The ground out there ran flat and pale all the way to where the eye finally gave up, and on a morning like that one, it looked less like farmland and more like the floor of an ocean that had drained away a long time ago and never thought to come back. Her name was Etta Sayer. She was 15 years old. She was not a banker. She was not a lawyer. She was not one of the clean-handed men who drove in from the cities to buy broken farms cheap and cut them into pieces small enough to sell to people who wanted a square of the prairie without ever understanding what the prairie cost. She was a girl in her father's brown chore coat, and she had come to a foreclosure auction the way some people come to a funeral. Quiet, early, certain of what they had come for. Her father had been dead 3 years by then. The coat was almost all she had left of him, that, and a way of standing with her weight square over both feet, the way he had stood. The coat still smelled faintly of him if she pressed her face into the collar, though she had stopped doing that because a thing like that you can wear out, and she did not want to wear it out. The sale was held under a rented canvas tent beside the Harlow homestead, where a windbreak of dead cedars marked the line between what had once been a family's entire life and what was now only acreage to be called out and knocked down to the highest hand. There were folding chairs set in crooked rows on the frozen ground. There was a plywood platform and a microphone that crackled in the cold. There was a clerk's table with a steel cash box and a stack of bidder cards held down against the wind by a river rock, and there was coffee in a steel urn that nobody trusted, but everybody drank because there was nothing else to do with their hands. Etta parked the truck at the edge of the lot, well away from the others. She sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel, breathing, watching the tent breathe with the wind, the canvas drawing in and letting out like something alive. Then she reached across the seat and picked up 2 things. One was an envelope from the grocery store, soft at the corners, and inside it, $682 in cash. Most of it 1s and 5s. All of it counted more times than she could remember. 2 years of selling eggs and bottle calves, and the summer she had spent walking beans for the Petrie place. Money that had been saved 1 slow dollar at a time in a coffee can in the dark by a girl who had never once in her life had a reason to spend it on something foolish and was about to spend it on the most foolish-looking thing in the county. The other was the map, a county soil survey sheet, pale blue, folded and unfolded so many times the creases had gone white and soft as cloth. She held it the way other girls her age held things that mattered to them, carefully, as if it could be taken from her. She got out. The cold took her breath for a second and then gave it back. She walked toward the tent with the map under her arm and the envelope buttoned inside her coat against her chest, where she could feel the corner of it with each step. She went to the clerk's table and gave her name and her mother's name, and the clerk, a heavy-set man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, looked at her the way you look at a child who has wandered somewhere they don't belong. "Bidding on something today, hun?" "Yes, sir." He gave her a card anyway because the rules said he had to, because anyone who registered got a card, and there was nothing in the rules about how old you had to be to lose your own money. Number 18. She closed her cold fingers around it. There were 39 registered bidders that morning. She had counted the cards on the table before he handed her one, because counting things was a habit her grandfather had drilled into her. Count what you can count so you know what you're standing in. Most of the 39 were local men, cattlemen, and dryland farmers, men with split knuckles and sunken cheeks and hats that had been shaped by years of weather instead of by any store. They knew this country the way you know a face you have looked at your whole life. They knew which wells had failed and which families were finished, which sections had been grazed down to the dirt, and which corners weren't worth the fence wire it would take to close them off. They stood in loose knots near the coffee urn, not talking much, breathing steam, waiting. Behind them sat a different kind of buyer. Cleaner men, pressed denim, and new boots and sunglasses hung from the pockets of pearl snap shirts. Men who had driven in from the cities to the east and the south because they had heard that broken ground in the panhandle could still be had for about the price of a used car. One of them had a portable telephone the size of a brick set on the chair beside him like a small dog. They had not come to farm. They had come to carve. And then there was Etta in the back row in a dead man's coat, 15 years old. The auctioneer's name was Royce Tanner. He was 62 that year, silver-haired and narrow as a fence post. And he had been calling sales across the southwest corner of the state for so long that men said he could sell cattle fast enough to make the numbers sound like weather coming in. He was standing near the clerk's table when Etta came through the tent flap, and he watched her come. He saw the coat. He saw the map. He saw the bidder card in her small, cold hand. He leaned toward the clerk, and he did not bother to lower his voice all the way. "Somebody's daughter," he said, "come to watch grown men lose money." The men close enough to hear it laughed. It was a small laugh, an easy one, the kind men give a thing that costs them nothing. A girl in a big coat. It was almost sweet the way she'd come out to the sale like it was a county fair. Etta heard every word. She did not look at them. She did not flinch, and she did not flush. She walked to the back row of folding chairs, and she sat, and she opened the blue map across her knees and flattened it with both hands, smoothing the soft creases, the way you smooth a quilt over someone who is cold. And that was the first thing nobody in that tent understood about her. She had not come to watch the auction. She had come to read the land, to understand why you have to understand her grandfather, because she did not get to that tent on her own, not really. She got there on the back of a dead man's whole long life. His name was Silas Sire, and everyone who had known him long enough had called him Si. He was born in 1924 on a tenant farm in the hard, dry edge of the state, and he had spent the first half of his life watching men blame heaven for what bad dirt and bad credit and bad record-keeping had done to them. He learned early that the sky was the easiest thing in the world to accuse because the sky never argued back and it never once showed you the ledger. A man could shake his fist at a cloud his whole life and feel righteous doing it, and the cloud would never make him sit down and look at why his neighbor's quarter held water and his own did not. When he was a young man after a war, he did not talk much about he took a job with the Soil Conservation Service. It was not a grand job, and it never paid like one. He measured slopes. He logged erosion cuts and well depths. He drove the county section roads until the inside of his government pickup smelled permanently of dust and hot vinyl and pencil shavings. And he wrote down what he saw in a hand so small and so careful. You could have said it in a Bible and not known the difference. The ranchers did not trust him at first. They called him a clipboard man. They said the government had never raised a calf in its life and had no business telling a man what his own ground would do. They said paper couldn't tell you a single thing about dirt, that you had to walk it and work it and bury family in it to know it. C never argued much with any of that. He would take off his hat, and he would listen, and he would make his notes, and he would get back in the truck and drive on to the next place. But at night after supper, when most men his age were asleep in their chairs with the radio going, Silas Sayre copied things: soil maps, well logs, drilling reports, state water bulletins, drought tables, anything that described what lay beneath the flat country. Everyone above it thought they already knew by heart. He kept it all in a cedar chest in the back bedroom of his small house outside Hartwell, 4 decades of it. The paper going soft and brown at the edges, the older sheets smelling of the cedar and of time. Most men collect photographs of the life they lived. Silas Sayre collected proof of the things other men refused to see. Etta was 7 years old the first time he took her riding with him. He called them drives. They were never just drives. He would stop the truck beside a barbed wire fence and put a stub of pencil in her small hand and say, "Mark on this paper where the buffalo grass changes color." And she would squint down the fence line until she found it, the place where the green went pale, and she would make her mark, and he would nod once and say, "Now ask yourself why." And then he would drive on without telling her, because he wanted the question to ride home with her and keep her awake. He would point at a low place in a pasture where the ground went pale and crusted, and nothing grew but a tough, salt-loving weed. And he would say, "Show me why the saltweed grows there, and not over here." He would lower an old brass conductivity meter into a stock tank on a length of twine and make her read the needle twice, because he told her the first reading is the one you want to believe, and the second reading is the one you can trust. She did not understand that for years. By the time she did, he had been teaching her the difference in everything, not just water. By the time she was 10, she could tell a shallow well from a deep one by the taste of the water on the end of her finger. The deep water rounder and colder and a little sweet, the shallow water flat and faintly bitter with the dust of the world it had only just left. By 12, she could lay a soil survey beside a driller's log and find the place where the official description and the actual ground did not quite agree. And there was always such a place. There is always such a place, her grandfather told her. The land keeps better records than the men who walk on it. It just doesn't tell you out loud. You have to read it. And then he had looked at her a long moment over the steering wheel and said the thing she would carry the rest of her life. Most men read until they find the answer they came in with. You read until the ground tells you what it actually wants to say. There's all the difference in the world between those two, Etta, and almost nobody knows there's a difference at all. He died in January of 1990. A heart attack in the machine shed on a cold morning, not so different from the one Etta would later drive into the auction. He was found with a wrench still in his hand and his hat still on his head, sitting against the workbench as if he had only stopped to rest. He was 65 years old. He left her 3 things. He left her the cedar chest full of 40 years of paper that nobody else had asked to see in 20. He left her the brass meter worn smooth and bright on one side by the press of his thumb. And he left her a yellow legal tablet with one line written across the top of the first page in that small, careful hand. Read what they skip. That was all. Read what they skip. The rest of the tablet, as far as anyone could see, was blank. So that is what she did. While the other girls in her grade thought about the spring dance and their first driver's licenses, and the boys who drove too fast on the county roads on Friday nights, Etta Sayer sat at her mother's kitchen table after the chores were done and read reports that no one had asked to see in 2 decades. She read soil surveys until she knew the symbols by heart. She read drilling logs in handwriting so bad it looked like fence wire someone had thrown on the ground. She read groundwater bulletins that smelled like basement shelves and mouse dust. And she read them not because anyone made her, but because somewhere in all that dead paper, her grandfather was still talking to her, still asking her, "Now ask yourself why." And she was not ready to stop listening. She was not ready for the talking to be over. And in February of 1991, 1 month before that white March morning, she found the Harlow reference. It was buried near the back of a state water report, printed on thin paper, with a pale blue cover, in a table most people would have turned past without slowing down. It was not in the summary. It was not in the map legend. It was in the kind of small print that exists as far as most men are concerned, only so that no one will ever read it. The report described a narrow, confined sandstone bed lying below the main shallow water zone south of Hartwell. Not large, not reliable enough to irrigate anything worth irrigating, but sealed tight under its own natural pressure in a few places where the shale above it had held without a crack. And one test hole drilled for a state survey in the year 1977 had struck that bed at just over 300 feet. She checked the legal description line by line the way he had taught her. The location matched Tract 4 of the Harlow sale. Then she checked the old well record. The original Harlow well had been drilled in the early 60s to 98 feet, and it had gone dry, and the family had written off the whole quarter as dead and never looked back. But 98 feet was nothing. 98 feet was a man stopping a third of the way to the answer because he was tired and broke and had never once been given a reason to believe there was anything deeper down there to find. The water was there. It had always been there. It was just below the place where everyone in the county had quietly agreed to quit looking. That was Tract 4. 60 acres of it called dry, 160 acres in all, a dead stock pond at its center, and an old windmill tower leaning over the pond, like something that had given up halfway through a prayer. The sale bill said it plain. No active well, no irrigation right, existing windmill non-functional, surface only, sold as is. Most men in that tent read that line and stopped reading. Etta Sayer had started there. Before the bidding began, while the men stood at the coffee urn and the city buyers checked their wristwatches, she folded the blue map under her arm and walked out of the tent alone and crossed onto Tract 4. The men watched her go with the lazy amusement grown men keep for a child doing something they have already decided is foolish. She did not care, or she had taught herself not to, which on a cold morning amounts to the same thing. She walked out past the dead pond, the cracked gray mud of it crunching like broken pottery under her boots, and she stood beside the leaning tower in the wind, and she opened the map. She looked at the low swell of ground to the west of the tower, the way it lifted just slightly out of the flat. She looked at the shallow draw that ran off it to the southeast, the way the land sloped and gathered and carried water it no longer had. She looked at the soil at her feet, the color of it, the salt crust on it, the places where even in March a tougher grass held its grip. She took the brass meter out of her coat pocket and held it in her bare hand, though there was no water within 300 feet of where she stood. For it to measure no water, her grandfather had spent his last living winters knowing was down there, and never once telling a soul. She held the meter anyway, not because it could help her yet, because it had been his, and his thumb had worn the one side bright, and holding it where his hand had worn it steadied her own. For a moment, she let herself feel exactly how alone she was. 15 years old, $600 in her coat, standing on dead ground that 39 grown men had already decided was worth nothing, about to do a thing that would either prove her grandfather right at last in front of the whole county, or make a public fool of the only person who had ever taught her anything in her life that was worth knowing. Then she folded the map back up, and she walked back to the tent, and she sat down in the back row, and she waited. At 4 minutes past 10, Royce Tanner climbed onto the plywood platform and tapped the microphone twice. It crackled. The tent went quiet the way a crowd goes quiet when the thing they have been standing around for is finally about to start. The first 3 tracks went almost exactly the way the county would have guessed they'd go. Tract 1 carried the house and the machine shed and the one good domestic well, and it sold high to a man from over by the river who had been wanting a place for a grown son. Tract 2 had the only decent grass on the whole quarter, and it pulled 2 local men into a short, hard fight that ended with both of them spending more than they had meant to, and neither of them happy about it. Tract 3 had a windmill that still turned on a kind day, and it went to a cattleman from the next county who had sworn all week to anyone who'd listen that he was not going to bid, and then raised his card before Royce had even finished the opening number. Etta did not move through any of it. She sat with the blue map folded on her lap and watched grown men decide the worth of things by what they could see from a folding chair. At 47 minutes past 10, Royce Tanner called Tract 4, and his voice changed. An auctioneer can tell a crowd exactly what he thinks of a thing without ever saying it. He read the description flat and fast, the way a man reads aloud the part of a contract he is hoping you will let him skip.
Tract 4, 160 acres dryland, no active well, no irrigation allotment, existing windmill non-functional, sold as is. He looked up over the rows of frozen folding chairs. Who'll give me 50 an acre to start?
Nothing. The wind moved the canvas.
40.
A man near the front made a sound that was not quite a laugh.
30 then. 30 to open.
Still nothing. Then a salvage buyer from the east raised his card without any enthusiasm in it at all.
25.
He wanted the steel. The fence posts, the leaning tower, the windmill iron, maybe the right to cut the whole dead quarter into 5-acre pieces and sell them one at a time to people moving west with more hope than money. Royce caught the bid and rolled into his chant.
I've got 25 looking for 30 now who'll say 30.
And in the back row, Etta Sayer raised bidder card number 18.
Not high, just high enough.
The laugh came before the number did. It started near the front and moved back through the tent, low and easy, some of it kind, and some of it not the laugh men give a child who has reached for something far above her head. The city buyer with the brick telephone turned in his chair to look at her. The salvage man twisted around. Royce Tanner saw the card, and for the smallest breath, he stopped. Then the old reflex took him, the reflex of 40 years of selling the reflex that does not care who is holding the card.
30 with number 18.
The salvage buyer stared at her the way a man stares at a gate he was certain he had locked the night before. Then he raised his card again, half annoyed now.
35.
39, Etta said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried to every corner of that cold tent, and the laughing stopped all at once. The way it does when a thing a crowd thought was a joke turns out after all to be in earnest. At $39 an acre, the quarter came to $6,240. The terms required 10% down by noon and the balance within 10 banking days. Etta had $682 in the envelope against her chest. Enough for the deposit. Not one single dollar more than enough. The salvage buyer looked out the open tent flap toward the dead pond and the leaning tower. He looked at the girl in the oversized coat. He looked back at the tower. And then he shook his head and let his card drop into his lap, because there are some things a salvage man knows are not worth the trouble, and a bidding fight with a 15-year-old over dead ground was one of them. Royce Tanner waited a beat, then another. Going once. The wind. Going twice. Etta did not breathe.
The gavel struck the plywood. Sold, tract 4, to number 18. And just like that, a 15-year-old girl in her dead father's coat had bought 160 acres that every grown man in that county had already buried in his own mind years before. She walked to the clerk's table with the grocery envelope in her hand, and her hands did not begin to shake until she started counting the bills out onto the table. The clerk counted it back to her $624 for the deposit, and she signed the purchase agreement in a tight, careful hand that was very nearly her grandfather's hand, and she slid the last of the bills back into her coat. $58 left to her name. She buttoned the pocket over it as if buttoning it would make it more. Royce Tanner came down off the platform while his assistant opened the bidding on Tract 5, and he crossed to her near the tent flap. The hardness had gone out of his face. Something quieter had come into it. "Girl," he said, and his voice was low now, almost gentle. "I don't know who told you that was a bargain, but whoever it was did you no kindness. That well's been dead longer than you've been alive." She looked up at him. "That well only went 98 feet. He blinked. She held the blue map against her chest with one hand. "There's a confined sandstone bed under the west half, about 312 feet down. The 77 test hole found pressure there. It's not irrigation water, but it's stock water if the shale seal holds." For a long moment, Royce Tanner did not say anything at all. And behind him, 3 of the local ranchers who had drifted toward the flap to leave had gone still enough to hear. "Where," he said finally, "did you get that?" "State Water Report. Appendix Table. My grandfather had a copy." What was his name? Silas Sayer. And that was the first thing that turned that cold morning from a story about a foolish girl into something else. Because Royce Tanner's face changed when she said the name. Not with surprise, with something older and heavier than surprise. Something that looked for just a second like shame, trying to find a place to stand. He looked away from her out across the dead pond toward the leaning tower, and the wind pulled at the brim of his hat. "I knew C. Sayer," he said. Etta waited. "Long time ago." He turned the words over carefully, the way a man handles something he is not sure he wants to pick up off the ground. "He tried to tell some folks in this county there was deep water underground they'd already wrote off. Years back, nobody listened to him. It didn't go well for him." "Why not?" Royce Tanner did not answer that. Not then. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of his hat brim, and he looked at the girl in the oversized coat with the map held against her chest, and something passed behind his eyes that she would not understand for a long time. "Your granddad was a careful man," he said at last. "Yes, sir. And careful men can still be wrong." She nodded. She did not argue. "Yes, sir." And that more than anything else she had said or done that whole morning was the answer that stayed with him. Because she did not say it the way a child says it to make the grown-up stop. She said it like someone who had already lain awake at night, doing the cold arithmetic of exactly what being wrong would cost, and had added it all up and had decided to walk in through the tent flap anyway. Royce Tanner had spent 40 years listening to men shout what land was worth across the front of a tent. He had never once heard a 15-year-old talk about the price of being wrong like she had already paid it in full. The auction ended before noon. The trucks pulled out one at a time, sending pale dust up over the section road, and the men who had laughed did not laugh again where she could hear them. A few of them looked at Tract 4 longer than they meant to as they drove past it on their way home. One of the city buyers went to the clerk and asked for a copy of the sale map after the gavel had already made it useless to him. Etta was loading her grandfather's map into the cab of the truck when a different man came across the lot toward her. He was younger than the cattlemen and cleaner than them, but he was not one of the city carvers either. He wore good boots that had actually seen ground and a canvas coat that fit him right cut for him. And he moved like a man who was used to being the most important person standing at any gate he chose to lean on. He was somewhere in his 40s. He had a face that smiled before it meant anything by it. "You're the Sayer girl," he said. It was not a question. Etta closed the truck door. "Yes, sir. I'm Dwight Crandall." He let the name sit there a second the way men do when they expect it to mean something. In that county, it did. The Crandalls held more water rights than any family for 50 miles in any direction, and they had held them long enough that most men around Hartwell had stopped thinking of it as a thing that could ever be otherwise. "You bought Tract 4. "Yes, sir. That's a curious thing for a girl your age to buy." The smile stayed on. The eyes did not. "Dry ground, dead well, no allotment. I'd have thought somebody would have talked you out of it before you ever got in that truck this morning." Nobody tried very hard. He laughed at that, a short laugh, and looked out toward the leaning tower the way Royce Tanner had, except where the old auctioneer had looked at it like an old wound that still ached in the cold. Dwight Crandall looked at it like a card somebody had played wrong at a table where he was used to winning. "Tell you what," he said, and he reached into his coat and took out a checkbook, the soft leather kind, the kind that had never once been rained on. "You made a deposit this morning. 600 and change, I'd guess. You sign that quarter over to me before the balance comes due, and I'll cover your deposit and put another 400 on top of it. Cash today if you want it that way. That's near $1,000 to a girl for one morning's trouble, and you walk away clean from the worst piece of ground in this county before it ever costs you another dime." It was in its way a generous offer. More than the salvage man would have given. More than the quarter was worth to anyone who believed what the sale bill said about it. And that was the second thing that turned the morning. Because a man like Dwight Crandall did not carry a checkbook across a frozen auction lot to do a 15-year-old girl a kindness. He did it because he wanted that ground. And men do not want badly, and suddenly a piece of land that they themselves have spent years telling everyone is dead. Etta looked at the checkbook a moment. Then she looked at his face. "Why do you want it?" The smile flickered just once like a lamp in a draft. "I told you, I'm doing you a favor.
"You've held the only good water in this county for as long as I've been alive," she said. "You don't need 160 acres of dry ground with a dead well on it." She paused, and the wind moved between them. "Unless it isn't dry." The lot went very quiet. The wind moved over the stubble. Dwight Crandall closed the checkbook slowly, and the smile that came back onto his face was a different smile than the one he had worn walking up thinner and older, and with no warmth left in it anywhere at all.
"You're Silas Sayer's blood, all right," he said. "He had the very same trouble. Couldn't leave a thing alone once he got it in his head. It was worth more than everybody said it was." He tapped the checkbook against his open palm. "It ended bad for him. You ought to think hard on that." "What ended bad for him?" But Dwight Crandall was already turning away, sliding the checkbook back into his coat, walking toward a clean truck at the edge of the lot. 10 banking days, he called back over his shoulder, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than if he had said it cruel. "You'll never raise that balance, girl. Not on dead ground. When the bank calls it, you come find me. The offer might not be near as good then as it is right now." He got in the truck and drove off down the section road, and the pale dust of him hung in the cold air a long time after the sound of the engine had gone. Etta stood by her grandfather's truck with the blue map in her hand and watched the dust settle slow back to the ground. And for the first time that whole morning, the cold seemed to find a way all the way through the coat to the skin. 3 things had happened in that tent and on that lot, and she turned them over one at a time on the long drive home. The first was that she had been right about the water. She believed that. She had read the table herself 3 times, 4, and she had stood out there on the ground and read it too. The swell and the draw and the salt crust and the 2 readings agreed, and her grandfather had taught her that when the paper and the dirt agree with each other, you can trust what they're telling you. The second was that Royce Tanner, who had laughed at her in front of the whole county, had stopped laughing the instant she said her grandfather's name, and had looked out at that dead pond like a man looking at the scene of something he had once done and could never undo. And the third was that Dwight Crandall, whose family had owned the water in that county for 2 full generations, had crossed a frozen lot to offer a 15-year-old girl $1,000 to walk away from 60 dead acres before she could put a bit in the ground. A careful man, her grandfather used to say, does not waste his time asking why the answer is sitting right there in the report. He asks why nobody ever bothered to write it down where folks could find it. And then he asks the harder question, Etta. He asks who it served to keep it buried. She had found the water in the small print. She understood that part now. What she did not yet understand driving north toward Hartwell with $58 in her coat and a balance due that she had no earthly way to pay was the rest of it. Why a man like Silas Sayer, the most careful man she had ever known, the man who copied every report so the truth could never be lost, the man who trusted the second reading of every needle, had found that same water years before she was born and had never once said a word about it to a living soul. The land kept records, he always told her. The land keeps its records even when men don't. But men kept records too. And some of them she was beginning to understand on that cold drive home, kept theirs buried on purpose. The truck climbed the long grade north of the Harlow place, and for 1 good mile the heater worked and the warm air moved over her cold hands, and then the road went flat again and the heat died the way it always did. She drove the rest of the way home in the cold, watching the pale country go by 60 dead acres, now hers, and no money in the world to prove they were anything else. And somewhere under the western half of them, 312 feet down in the dark water that had been waiting in the small print for longer than anyone alive could remember. She had 10 banking days, and she was beginning to understand that the auction had never really been about money at all. The house outside Hartwell stood at the end of a half-mile dirt track. A low-frame house the color of weathered bone with a porch that sagged on the north end where the ground had settled under it over the years. There was a barn behind it and a machine shed behind that, and the machine shed was where Silas Sayer had died. And Etta still did not go into it any more than she had to. She came home from the auction in the early afternoon, with the cold still in her hands and the purchase papers folded in her coat, and she found her mother standing at the kitchen sink, with her arms crossed, watching the track through the window. Nora Sayer had been watching that track since before noon. She was a thin woman, worn smooth the way the country wore everything smooth, and she had buried her father-in-law the winter before, and her husband 3 years before that, and she had learned the hard, slow way you learn it not to expect good news to come up that track. She did not ask if Etta had bought it. She could see the answer in the way the girl carried herself across the yard. "How much?" Nora said. $6,240, 10% down, the rest in 10 banking days. Her mother closed her eyes. When she opened them, she did not look angry. She looked tired in a way that went past anger, the way a person looks when they have finally run out of room left to be surprised. "And what's in that account, Etta?" $58. Nora Sayer turned back to the window. Out past the barn, the pale country ran flat to the horizon. The same country it had always been, the country that had taken her husband's health and her father-in-law's life and given back so little that you had to read the small print of it just to find anything at all worth keeping. For a long moment, she did not say anything. The clock over the stove ticked. The wind worked at the loose board on the north end of the porch. "Your granddad," she said finally, and her voice was careful, "filled your head with a great many things, Etta, and most of them were good. He was the only one in this whole family who ever made you feel like the world wasn't trying to close itself in on you." She turned around from the window. "But he's dead now, and the bank doesn't take soil maps for a balance. You hear me? They take money, and we don't have it. We have $58 and 160 acres of ground that put a leaning tower over a dry pond." "I know. You bid on dead ground in front of the whole county."
I know what I bid on." And there it was, the thing about the girl that her mother could never quite get her two hands around. The same quiet certainty that her grandfather had carried in him, like a stone in his pocket. The thing that had made grown men in a tent stop laughing. Nora Sayer looked at her daughter, standing in the kitchen in a coat too big for her 15 years old, and broke and bound to a thing that could swallow them both whole. And she felt the old helpless love you feel for someone who is going to walk into the fire, whether or not you stand in the door.
"What's your plan?" she said. It was not surrender,
But it was close to it.
"I drill it," Etta said. "If the water comes in like the report says, I lease it for stock water to the neighbors that need it, and that pays the balance and pays the driller, and after that, it just keeps paying. If it doesn't come in, I lose everything, and I work off the rest, however long it takes. And if no driller in this country will touch it, then I find one that will."
That night, after her mother had gone to bed, Etta sat alone under the yellow kitchen light, with the cedar chest open on the floor beside her, and she read the Harlow table again and again. She read it until the lamp drew moths up against the cold window glass, and the house had gone so quiet she could hear the well pump cycle on and off out by the barn. She was not reading it because she doubted it. She was reading it because it was the closest thing she had left in the world to her grandfather's voice, and the house was very empty, and she was very young, and she was afraid in a way she had not let her mother see across the kitchen. This was the low point, not the laughter in the tent, not the auctioneer's gentle warning. The low point came at 11:30 that night alone under the lamp, when Etta Sayer understood all the way down to the bottom of herself that if she was wrong, she had not just lost her savings and her ground. She had taken the best thing her grandfather had ever taught her, the thing that had made him a careful and a decent man through a hard life, and she had carried it out into the middle of the county and stood it up where everyone could see it. And if the hole came up dry, she would have made his whole quiet life look like exactly the foolishness the laughing men had always said it was. For the first time since the funeral, she wished he were there. Not to comfort her, to read the table with her, to put his thumb down on the line and say, "There, that's the number, you didn't miss anything, girl." But the house stayed quiet, and the moths beat against the glass, and there was no one to read it but her. So she read it herself, one more time, and the number was the same number it had always been. Then she closed the chest, and she went to bed, and she did not sleep much, and in the morning she got up in the dark and did the chores and washed the dust off her hands and asked her mother to drive her north of town to see a man named Hollis Boyd. Hollis Boyd ran 2 rotary drilling rigs out of a corrugated steel shop on the highway north of town, and he was 58 years old that year. Broad through the shoulders with drilling mud worked so deep into the creases of his hands that no amount of washing would ever take it out.
He had drilled farm wells and stock wells in that country since before Etta was born, and he had pulled enough dry holes in his life to know exactly how expensive hope could be, and to have no patience left at all for the cheap kind of hope. Etta laid it all out on the steel workbench in his shop. The sale bill, the state water report open to the appendix table with a clean finger holding it flat, the county soil survey, the old well record from the 60s, and her grandfather's yellow tablet with the one line written across the top of the page. Hollis Boyd read for the better part of half an hour. He did not interrupt her once. He did not flatter her, and he did not smile. He read the way a man reads who knows in his bones that the difference between a careful reading and a quick one can cost a family everything they have left. And when he was finally done, he tapped the old test hole number with one thick, stained finger. "I knew your grandfather," he said. Etta had learned by then that men said this in two very different ways. Some said it the way you mention a thing to make yourself sound important, as if having once known a man made you the authority on him forever. And some said it the way you take your hat off in church, like the name itself asked for better manners than you'd been using. Hollis Boyd said it the second way. "He ever teach you what a dry hole costs?" "Yes, sir." "You got it that kind of money?" "No, sir." Hollis Boyd leaned back against his workbench and folded his arms, and the mud-dark creases of them caught the gray light from the shop window. "Then what exactly," he said, "are you asking me for?" "I need you to drill to 330 feet, Etta said. "I think the water comes in around 312 on the west half where the 77 test hole found pressure. If it does, I pay you first out of the water lease before I pay anybody else in this world. If it comes up dry, I'll work it off, however long that takes me." He looked at her hands a long time. They were small, but they were not soft. There were fence cuts on them, and a wire burn healed pale across the back of 1.5 moon scar from a feed auger that had caught her finger when she was 12, and her grandfather had wrapped it himself and told her a working hand was an honest hand and not to cry over it. They were a working girl's hands. "You know how long working it off takes," he said, "on what a driller charges by the foot. You'd be a grown woman before you were ever clear of it." "Longer than I want," she said. "I know that." Hollis Boyd was quiet for a while. The wind moved a loose sheet of steel somewhere up on the roof of the shop, and it groaned and settled. Then he reached out and folded the state report closed slow and deliberate, like a man closing a book he had finally decided about. "I'll drill 1 hole," he said. "1. I stop at 330 unless I see a reason in the cuttings to keep going, and I'll be the one who decides what counts as a reason, not you. You sign the note. Your mother signs it too, because the law won't let a girl your age sign it on her own." He paused, and his eyes went hard not at her, but at something past her, some old account of his own. "And there's one more thing, and it's not for sale. When this is over dry or wet, nobody in this county gets to say Hollis Boyd took a child's money on a fool's errand. I won't have that on my name. I've spent 58 years building that name, and I won't have it." Etta nodded once. "They won't say that," she said. "They'll say I talked you into it."
and for the first time, the corner of Hollis Boyd's mouth moved just slightly.
"Let them,"
he said. They set the drilling date for the 3rd of April. That gave her 8 banking days. She would still have to make the balance on the land come due, and the only honest way she could see to do that was to find a bank that would carry her the way her plan needed carrying against the water that was not yet out of the ground. So 2 days after she stood in Hollis Boyd's shop, Etta and her mother drove into Hartwell to see the man at the bank. The bank in Hartwell was a low brick building on the corner of the only intersection in town with a working light, and the man who ran it was named Curtis Renfro, and he had known the Sayers their whole lives. He had carried Nora's husband through 2 bad years before the cancer took him. He had buried money worries for half the county and pulled a few families back from the edge of the cliff with his own quiet hand. He was not a hard man. That was what made what happened harder to bear than it might have been. He had Etta's plan in front of him on the desk. She had written it all out herself in her grandfather's small, careful hand. The drilling costs and the lease income and the timeline, the whole thing laid out the exact way Silas Sayer would have laid it out for a man he was trying to convince. Curtis Renfro had read every line of it, and when they came in and sat down across the desk from him, he did not meet their eyes the way a man meets the eyes of people he has already decided to help.
"Etta,"
he said.
"Nora."
He moved the papers a half-inch on the desk as though straightening them would help him say it. I want you both to know I read every word of this, and I want you to know it's a better thought-out plan than most grown men in this county bring through that door. But, Nora said, but I can't carry it. He said it quiet. I'm sorry. I can't extend the financing on Tract 4. Not the drilling, not the balance, not any part of it. Etta felt it like cold water poured down the back of the coat. It's good collateral if the water comes in. The lease income covers the note inside 2 years. I showed the numbers. They're right. I checked them 4 times.
"The numbers are good,"
Curtis Renfro said, and now he did look at her, and there was something in his face that she would think about for a long time afterward, because it was not the face of a man who had simply decided no on his own. It was the face of a man who had been told no by somebody else and was passing it along against his own will. The numbers are good, Etta. Better than good. That's not the trouble here. The trouble isn't your numbers. Then what is it? He was quiet a moment. He looked at the window where the one working light cycled red and green out over the empty intersection. And then, because he was not a hard man, and because he had buried enough of this family's worries over the years to feel he owed them at least the truth he told her more than he should have.
"There's parties in this county,"
he said slowly,
"who hold a great deal of paper at this bank. Water paper, land paper, the kind of paper a bank the size of mine lives or dies on. And it was made known to me day before yesterday in a friendly enough way that those parties would take it very poorly if this bank financed a well on Tract 4. He stopped. That's all I can say to you. That's already more than I should have said.
Etta sat very still in the chair. The Crandalls, she said. Curtis Renfro did not confirm it, but he did not deny it either, and the not denying was its own kind of answer. He folded his hands on the desk and looked down at them. An honest man caught between his own conscience and the paper that kept his doors open and his tellers paid. And Etta understood, looking at him, that he had not chosen this, and that it shamed him to his bones. "I'm sorry," he said again, genuinely. "If it were only ever up to me." And that was the third thing that turned the story, and it turned it hard. Because up until that moment, sitting in that office, Etta could have told herself a simpler story. That the men had laughed because they were proud and tired and beaten down by 10 years of low prices. That the land was cheap because the county was wrong about it, the plain way a county can be wrong about a thing for 40 years, for no better reason than habit. That she was right, and they were merely mistaken, and that being right would be enough. But a man does not lean on a bank to stop a 15-year-old from drilling a single well unless he is afraid of what that well is going to find. And a man is never afraid of dry ground. Dwight Crandall had offered her $1,000 to walk away, and when she would not, he had gone to the bank to make certain she could not stay. He was not trying to take a piece of dead ground off her hands as a favor to a child. He was trying to keep that water in the ground where it was. She did not fully understand why not yet not sitting in Curtis Renfro's office with the red and green light cycling on the empty street outside. But she understood the shape of it now. This was not a county being wrong by accident. This was a thing being held wrong on purpose. And it had been held wrong on purpose for a long time longer than she had been alive. And somewhere in the middle of all of it was her grandfather, the most careful man she had ever known, who had found this same water years ago and never told a living soul.
It ended bad for him, Dwight Crandall had said. You ought to think on that.
She drove home with her mother in a silence that was different from the silence on the night of the auction. That first silence had been fear. This one was something closer to anger, banked down low and steady, the kind of fire that does not flare up and does not cool off. "We'll find another bank," Nora said finally halfway home. She did not sound like she believed it.
"There isn't another bank in 50 miles that'll cross the Crandalls," Etta said. "Not for us. Not on this." She watched the country go by out the window. "We don't need a bank." "Etta, the balance is due in 6 days now. The drilling's another cost stacked on top of it. We don't have it, and we can't borrow it. How in the world do you figure we don't need a bank?" "Hollis Boyd said he'd drill on a note against the water. He never said anything about needing the bank's money up front to do it." Etta turned from the window to her mother. "And the balance on the land, I'll go to the neighbors.
The thirsty ones. The ones the dry years have got by the throat. I'll lease them the water before it's even out of the ground. Pre-sell it. They pay me now against delivery, and I pay the land balance with that. And if the water doesn't come in, I give them their money back out of whatever I've got left, and I work off the rest of it to Hollis Boyd for the rest of my natural life. She said it flat and steady, like she had been turning it over for 2 days, because she had. Nobody in this county will lend me $1, but some of them will buy water if they're thirsty enough to gamble on a sayer. Nora Sayer drove a while without speaking. Then she said very quietly, "You are so much like him it scares me half to death." "Granddad." "Your grandfather. Your father too. Both of them." She kept her eyes hard on the road. Both of them dead before their time working ground that never once gave back what it took out of them. And here you are, 15 years old, betting every single thing we've got left on that same dirt. Her hands tightened on the wheel until the knuckles stood up white. "I'm not telling you to quit. I gave up on that yesterday. I'm telling you I'm scared, and you ought to know it because somebody in this family ought to be honest with you about what this kind of thing can cost a person." Etta looked at her mother's profile, the worn smoothness of it, the way the country had written itself into her face year by year. "He didn't bet on the dirt," Etta said. "That's the thing everybody always got wrong about him. He never bet on anything in his life. He read it. The dirt was always going to do what it was going to do no matter what any man hoped. He just made sure he knew what that was before everybody else did." She paused. "I'm not gambling, Mama. I read it. There's all the difference in the world between those two." But that night alone under the kitchen lamp again, the difference did not feel quite as solid as she had made it sound out there in the truck. Because something Curtis Renfro had said had lodged itself in her and would not come loose. "There's parties in this county who hold a great deal of paper at this bank. The Crandalls held the water rights for 50 miles. They had held them for 2 full generations. And her grandfather had found years before she was born a confined sandstone bed full of dependable water underground nobody else believed in, and he had written it down in his careful hand. And then he had buried it in a cedar chest and never said one word. Why, a careful man doesn't waste his time asking why the answer's there. He had told her more than once in the truck on the long roads. He asks why nobody wrote it down where folks could find it. And then he asks who that served. But somebody had written it down. Her grandfather had. He had written it down and then hidden it. And that was a thing Etta had never once questioned in all the long months she had been reading his papers, because it had simply never occurred to her that her grandfather would hide a true thing from anyone. He was the man who copied every report, so the truth could never be lost. He was the man who had taught her that the land keeps records even when men don't. So why had he kept this one secret? Why this one of all of them? She got down on the floor beside the cedar chest and she began to take it apart. Not just reading it now, searching it. She lifted out the soil maps and the well logs and the drought tables and the bulletins layer by careful layer, the way she had never once done before, because she had always read the chest, the way you read a library, taking out what you wanted and leaving the rest where it lay. Now she emptied it down to the wood. She ran her fingers along the cedar bottom of it into the corners where the wood had gone dark with age, and she found nothing, and she sat back on her heels in the lamplight, and she thought. Read what they skip. She had always taken that line to mean the world. Read the small print the other men skip. Read the appendix tables. Read the parts of the report that nobody reads. But what if it had not meant the world? What if it had meant him? She picked up the yellow tablet, the one with the line written across the top of the first page, and she had read that first page 100 times in a year, but she had never once turned past it because the rest of the tablet was blank. Or she had always assumed it was blank. She turned the first page now. Blank. The second. Blank. She turned the blank pages one after another, faster, now all the way to the cardboard backing at the very end. And tucked between the last blank page and the backing flat and yellowed and folded once was an envelope. Her grandfather's hand on the front. One word. Etta. Her own name. He had written her own name on it before he died and slid it into the back of the tablet where only someone who read all the way to the end would ever find it. Where only someone who actually did what the first page told them to do, read what they skip, would ever think to look. Her hands were not steady when she opened it. Inside was a single sheet folded once covered front and back in the small, careful hand. And the date written at the top was September of 1989. 4 months before he died in the machine shed, with the wrench still in his hand. She read it under the lamp with the moths beating against the glass and the kitchen and the dark country and the 6 days and the unpaid balance all fell away from her. And there was only her grandfather's voice coming up out of the paper one last time, telling her, at last, the thing he had never once been able to say out loud to her in life. He had found the water in 1977. He wrote it plainly. The state had drilled the test hole for their survey, and he had logged it himself with his own hands. And he had known exactly what it meant the moment the bit came up wet at 312 feet. He had known that under the dead Harlow ground and under a good deal of the ground all around it there lay a sealed bed of stock water that men had been driving their trucks over for 100 years without ever once reaching it. He had been proud of it. He wrote that too, and the writing of it was the proudest thing in the whole letter, the proudest finding of his entire working life. And he had taken it to the county, to the man who held the water then, Burl Crandall, the old man, Dwight's father, who controlled what little reliable water there was in those parts, and controlled through it a great deal of what other men in the county could and could not do with their own lives. Silas Sayer had carried his report to Burl Crandall because Burl Crandall had the means to develop that water and bring it to the families who were dying for want of it. And Silas had believed, being the kind of man he was clear down to the ground, that a true thing carried in good faith to a powerful man would be used for good. He had been wrong about that. It was the only thing in his whole long, careful life that he had been truly, badly, ruinously wrong about. And he wrote it down for her so that she would know it, and so that she would never make the same mistake about powerful men that he had made, because Burl Crandall did not want that water found. Reliable water underground that had always been cheap and dry would mean that the families pinned down under the Crandall water rights, the families who had to come to the Crandalls hat in hand for every dependable drop their cattle drank, would no longer need to come at all. It would break a hold that the family had spent 2 generations building one locked gate at a time. New water in that county was not a gift to Burl Crandall. It was a knife laid against everything he had. So he had not used the report. He had buried it. And when Silas Sayer would not let it go, when he kept on talking around the county about the deep water under the south ground, Burl Crandall had set out coldly and patiently to ruin him. He spread it through the county that the clipboard man had finally gone soft in the head, that he was chasing water that wasn't there, that he'd cost a man his whole place on a fool's drilling if anybody around Hartwell was dumb enough to listen to a word he said. He made Silas Sayer a joke.
The careful man, the man who read what others skipped, made into the county fool over the one true finding he was proudest of in all his life. And it had worked the way these things were in a small country. Men laughed. The report went into the cedar chest, and Silas Sayer, rather than fight a man who could break his family the way he had so easily broken his good name, went quiet.
He went quiet to protect them. That was the part that broke Etta's heart, reading it there on the kitchen floor under the lamp. He had a granddaughter and a widowed daughter-in-law, and not much else in the wide world. And Burl Crandall had let him understand, in the quiet ways powerful men have of letting a man understand a thing, that pushing the water any further would cost the people Silas loved a great deal more than it would ever cost Silas himself. So the most careful man in the county made the most careful and the most bitter calculation of his entire life, and he chose his family over his pride, and he buried the truest thing he had ever found, and he carried the weight of it alone for the rest of his days. But he could not bury it forever. He could not stand to die with it buried. So he wrote it all down, the finding and the burying and the cold reason for both, and he sealed it in an envelope with his granddaughter's name on it, and he hid it behind the blank pages of a tablet whose first page told her how to find it. Read what they skip. And at the bottom of the page, in a hand that had begun near the very end of his life to shake just slightly. He had written the last thing. I was right about the water. I was wrong to be afraid. If you are reading this, then you have grown into someone who reads all the way to the end, and that is the only inheritance I ever cared to leave. The Harlow West half is the place. 312 feet. The shale seal holds on the Western Swell, not where they drilled the test. They put their hole in the wrong spot on purpose, so the official record would read uncertain and no honest driller would ever chase it. Drill the West Swell, not the marked location. The land kept the record true, even when the men would not. I am only sorry I did not have the courage to keep it true myself. You are braver than I was at your age, or any age. Make me right. Etta sat on the cold kitchen floor a long time with the page in her two hands. Outside, the wind moved over the pale country in the dark, over the dead Harlow ground 13 miles south, over the leaning tower and the dry pond and the sealed bed of water 312 feet down that her grandfather had found, and a powerful man had buried, and a careful, frightened, loving man had been too afraid to dig back up while there was breath in him. She understood it all now. Why the ground was cheap. Why Dwight Crandall had crossed a frozen lot with a checkbook in his hand. Why the bank had been leaned on the very day after the sale. Why the old Harlow well had been let go to 98 feet and stopped. Why the test hole in the official records sat in the wrong spot so the survey would read uncertain and no one would ever chase it. It was not a county being wrong by accident. It was 40 years of a thing being held wrong on purpose by men who profited from the dark, and she was the only person alive who held the proof in her grandfather's own steady hand that it had ever once been otherwise. She did not cry, though she wanted to, badly sitting there on the floor. She folded the page carefully back into the envelope, and she put the envelope inside her coat against her chest, in the same place where the deposit money had ridden to the auction. Then she got up off the floor and went and found the county map, and she laid it out flat under the lamp, and she found Tract 4, and she found the marked location of the 1977 test hole, the one written in the official record. And then she moved her finger west to the low swell of ground. Her grandfather's letter had named the swell she had stood on in the cold the morning of the auction, and felt was right without yet knowing why she felt it. The marked hole and the real water were not in the same place. They never had been. The record had been set on purpose by frightened, greedy men in the wrong spot. In the morning, she would call Hollis Boyd, and she would tell him that they were not drilling where the sale bill and the survey said to drill. They were drilling the West Swell. And when he asked her how she knew, she would have to decide right there how much to tell him, because the thing she now carried in her coat against her chest was bigger than a well and bigger than a balance. And she was 15 years old, and she was the only one left in the world who knew it. She turned off the kitchen lamp. In 4 days, the balance was due, and she had no money for it. In 5 days, Hollis Boyd would put a bit into the ground, and somewhere across the dark county in a warm house with good dependable water running from every tap, Dwight Crandall was waiting for the bank to call her note, certain she would never raise the balance on dead ground, certain that when it was all over, she would come to him at last, hat in hand, the way her grandfather had come, the way the whole county had come for 2 generations. He did not know about the envelope. He did not know that the careful man had kept the record after all in the end, and had left it to someone brave enough to read it all the way to the end. The next 4 days were the longest of Etta Sayer's life, and she spent every one of them on the road. She did not go to another bank, because there was no other bank in 50 miles that would cross the Crandalls, and she had finally stopped pretending otherwise. Instead, she did the thing she had told her mother she would do, the thing that frightened her far more than the drilling, because it meant standing in front of grown men at their own kitchen tables and asking them to believe her with their own hard money on the line. She went to the neighbors, the thirsty ones, the ones the dry years had pushed to the very edge, who needed dependable stock water for the summer grazing and could not get it for any price because the only dependable water for 50 miles in any direction ran through gates that the Crandalls held shut. She drove her grandfather's truck from one hardscrabble place to the next, the heater dying every single time the road went flat. And at every kitchen table she laid out the same things: the state report, the soil survey, the old well record. She did not show any of them the envelope. That was hers and her grandfather's, and it was not for trading. But she showed them the water in the small print the way he had taught her, and she made every one of them the same plain offer. Lease the water before it ever comes out of the ground. Pay now against delivery at a price below what dependable stock water was worth in a dry county in a dry year. If the water came in, they would have it for their summer grass at a fraction of what the Crandalls had always charged them. And if it did not come in, she would give every dollar back out of whatever she had left. And the loss would be hers, and Hollis Boyd's, not theirs. Most of them said no. Some of them said no kindly with real sorrow in it. And some of them said it the way men say a thing they have decided makes them sound smart in front of their wives, and 1 or 2 of them laughed at her outright, and the laughing was a great deal harder to take at a man's own kitchen table than it had been in a tent full of strangers. They had all heard about the auction. The Sayer girl who bought the dead Harlow quarter for $39 an acre. They had heard, too, in the quiet ways news moves through a county, that the bank in Hartwell would not touch it with a pole. And a man who has heard the bank say no does not like to be the one who says yes. But 3 of them did not say no. 3 men who were thirsty enough or stubborn enough, or who remembered Silas Sayer well enough and warmly enough to gamble a little money on his blood, sat at their kitchen tables and looked a long time at the small print, and then a long time at the 15-year-old girl in the oversized coat and signed their names. Not for much, any one of them alone. But together, the 3 prepaid leases came to enough to cover the balance on the land with a little to spare, enough to keep the quarter from falling back to the auction block and into the open, waiting hands of Dwight Crandall. The last of the 3 was an old cattleman named Aldous Petrie, who had grazed the country south of the Harlow place his whole long life, and had watered his herds at the Crandall tanks his whole life, and had hated every single gate he ever opened to do it. He read the report through twice, slow moving his lips a little, and then he set it down and looked at Etta a long time across his kitchen table. "Your size granddaughter," he said, "drilling the deep water under the south ground." "Yes, sir." "He told me about that water one time, 20 years back, maybe more than that. Told me there was a sealed bed down there that nobody had ever reached." Aldous Petrie's jaw worked. Then he just quit talking about it, all of a sudden. Wouldn't say another word on the subject the rest of his life, and I knew him another 15 years. I always did wonder what made a man like Cy Sayer go that quiet on a thing he'd been that sure of. Etta said nothing. The envelope was warm against her chest. "I think I know now," the old man said, watching her face close. "Same thing that makes the bank go quiet on you." He pulled the lease toward him across the table and uncapped a pen with his teeth. "I've opened Crandall gates for 40 years, girl. I am sick to death of opening Crandall gates. I'd sooner water my cattle on Sayer water if you can find it down there. Where do I sign my name?" She paid the balance with 2 banking days to spare. She drove into Hartwell with the prepaid lease money buttoned in her coat, and she walked into Curtis Renfro's bank, and she paid the purchase balance on Tract 4 in full in cash, counted out across the same desk where he had told her 3 days before that he could not help her. Curtis Renfro counted it and stamped the agreement paid in full, and when he handed her back the stamped copy, his hand was not quite steady, and he looked at her over the desk with an expression that was not quite an apology, and not quite pride, but had real pieces of both worked into it. "You found another way," he said. "There's always another way," Etta said, "if you read far enough." She did not say it cruel, but she did not soften it either, and Curtis Renfro took it the way it was meant, which was as a true thing, said plainly by someone who had earned the right to say it to him. They started drilling on the 3rd of April in the first gray light the way they had said it. Hollis Boyd brought the rig across the Harlow quarter at dawn. The mast laid down flat along the truck bed like a folded crane, and Etta rode out ahead of it in her grandfather's pickup to mark the spot. Not the spot on the sale bill, not the marked location of the 1977 test hole sitting wrong in the official record where old Burl Crandall had been content to let it sit and rot for 14 years. She drove out past the dead pond and the leaning tower to the low swell of ground on the west half, the place her grandfather's letter had named the place she had stood on the morning of the auction and felt was right without yet understanding why. And she set a steel stake there in the cold, hard ground
and waited for the rig to crawl up the section road.
Hollis Boyd climbed down from the truck and looked at her stake, and then he looked at the sail map in his hand, and then he looked back at her. "That's not the marked location," he said. "Test hole's 200 yards east of here by the record. Survey says the water's by the old test hole if it's anywhere at all."
"The survey's wrong," Etta said. "On purpose. They put the test hole in the wrong spot so the record would read uncertain and nobody honest would ever chase it. The seal holds on this swell, not where they drilled. We drill here."
Hollis Boyd was quiet a moment. He was a man who had drilled where the records told him to drill his entire working life, because the records were usually all that a man had to go on. And here was a 15-year-old girl in a dead man's coat telling him to his face that the record itself had been faked. "How do you know that?" he said, and she had decided on the long, cold drive out that morning exactly how much she would tell him. Not all of it. The envelope stayed hers, but enough to ask an honest man to trust her. "My grandfather logged that test hole himself in 77, she said. "He knew where the water was. He stood right there when the bit came up wet. The record got set down wrong by men who did not want it found. He left me the real location before he died in his own hand." She held his eyes and did not look away. "You said you'd decide what counted as a reason to keep drilling, Mr. Boyd. I'm asking you to decide that the man who taught me to read this whole country knew where his own test hole hit water. Drill the swell. If I'm wrong about it, it's on me the way we said it would be." Hollis Boyd looked at the steel stake standing in the ground for a long moment. Then he looked south and east toward the warm country where the Crandall water ran free, and something moved in his weathered face, some old account of his own that Etta would never fully come to know. "See, Sayer logged half the wells in this county before I ever owned a rig of my own," he said finally. "And I never one time knew that man to be wrong about water." He spat in the cold dust and turned back toward the truck. "We'll drill the swell." By 7, the mast was up against the pale sky. By 8, the bit was turning, and the rig's diesel pounded out across the flat country in a slow, heavy rhythm that you could feel coming up through the ground into your boots. And the first cuttings began to come up out of the hole. For the first 100 feet, nothing happened that anybody who had ever drilled that country would not have flatly expected. Dry cuttings, pale dust, a little sand. Old disappointment hauled up out of the dark in a steady gray stream and spread on the ground beside the hole, and it looked exactly like every dead dry well that had ever been drilled in Cimarron County since the country was settled. And that was the trouble with it, because people came. They came the way people always come to watch a thing that just might go wrong. A truck stopped on the section road first, then 2. Then by mid-morning, there were 6 or 7 of them pulled up in a line along the fence, men leaning on tailgates with their hats pushed back, watching the rig pound away at the dead Harlow ground. Nobody would say out loud that they had driven out to watch a girl be wrong, but none of them left either. Word had gone all the way around the county by then. The Sayer girl, the dead quarter, the well that the bank in Hartwell wouldn't touch with a borrowed pole. And then a little before noon, a clean truck came up the section road and pulled in, apart from the others. And Dwight Crandall got out and leaned on the fence and watched. And he did not so much as pretend he had come for any reason, but to see it fail. At 200 feet, the cuttings were still bone dry. At 270, the dust coming up out of the hole began to darken. At 304 feet, Hollis Boyd throttled the rig down and reached into the stream of cuttings and held something up between two thick fingers and turned it in the gray light. And Etta crossed the cold ground to him fast and looked at it lying in his palm. It was a damp gray shaving of shale. She knew it the moment she laid eyes on it. The shale was the lid, the seal, the cap. Her grandfather's letter had named the layer of dense rock that held the water down beneath it under its own pressure that you had to break clean through to reach the bed below. The report had said the seal held on the Western Swell, and here it was coming up out of the Western Swell, exactly where she had set her stake, and exactly where the official record swore there was nothing at all. Every sound in the whole world seemed to move a long way off. Hollis Boyd looked at the shale, and then he looked at Etta, and he did not say a single word, but the look on his face was its own kind of speech. He throttled the rig back up. The bit down into the shale, and along the fence line the men on the tailgates
went still, because even the ones who had never drilled a well in their lives would feel that something had changed in the rhythm of the day.
And then at 307 feet, the hole went dry. Not the cuttings. The water that should have begun to seep up around the bit as it worked the shale, the first wet hint of the bed waiting below the wet that by every right ought to have come, it stopped. The cuttings came up powder dry. The bit ground on down into the shale and brought up nothing but gray dust, and the heavy diesel rhythm pounded on, and there was no water in any of it. Hollis Boyd drilled to 310. Dry. 312. Dry. The very number her grandfather had written down for her, the number in the report, the number she had read 100 times under the kitchen lamp, and the hole came up bone dry at it. Along the fence, the men began to look sidewise at one another. Etta felt the cold come all the way through the coat to the skin the way it had in the auction lot when Dwight Crandall had walked away from her into the wind. 314. 315. Dry. Hollis Boyd throttled the rig down to a low idle and wiped his hands slow on a rag and would not look at her. And that was the very worst of it, that a man as decent and as honest as Hollis Boyd could not make himself meet her eyes because he was a kind man at the bottom of him, and he did not want her to see written on his face what the dry cuttings had already said out loud. Down the fence line, Dwight Crandall pushed off the rail. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He just nodded once slow, like a man whose whole understanding of the world had been quietly confirmed, and turned to walk back to his clean truck. And one by one, the men along the fence began to straighten up off their tailgates and reach for their door handles, because there is nothing on this earth harder to stand and watch than a thing you suspected all along would fail failing right in front of you. And they had seen about enough. This was the moment, the real one. Worse than the kitchen lamp at 11:30, worse than the laughter in the tent. Etta Sayer stood beside a dry hole at 315 feet on ground that the whole county had sworn was dead, with 3 thirsty neighbors' prepaid lease money hanging in the balance, and a debt to Hollis Boyd she would work off until she was an old woman. And the man who had buried this water for 40 years was walking away from her, satisfied, and her grandfather's good name was about to become all over again. The exact same joke that Burl Crandall had made of it once before. And in that moment, she did the only thing her grandfather had ever really truly taught her to do. She read it again. She pulled the envelope out of her coat there in the cold beside the idling rig with the men getting into their trucks. And she unfolded the page in her shaking hands. And she read the lines she had already read a dozen times over. And this time, she read them the way he had taught her to read a thing when the easy reading had failed her. Slowly, all the way to the end, reading what she had skipped. The shale seal holds on the Western Swell, not where they drilled the test. The land kept the record. The seal holds on the swell. She had read that line to mean that the water was under the swell. But that was not what the line said. It said, "The seal held on the swell." The seal, the shale, the cap held tight and unbroken on the high ground of the swell, and water under a sealed, unbroken cap does not pool up at the high point of the seal. It runs downhill under the rock, and it gathers where the sealed bed dips lowest, the very way her grandfather had stopped the truck 100 times beside 100 pastures and pointed and said, "Show me why the saltweed grows there and not over here." Water goes to the low place, always. He had taught her that before she was 8 years old, and she had drilled the high place. She had drilled the high point of the seal. She should have drilled where the seal dipped, and the seal dipped to the southeast down the shallow draw that ran off the swell, the same shallow draw she had looked straight at the morning of the auction and not understood that she was already reading. She looked up from the page. The men were climbing into their trucks. "Mr. Boyd?" Her voice did not carry far over the idling diesel, but he heard it.
"We're in the seal. We're not through it yet. We've been drilling the high point of it. The water's down dip. We have to move the hole."
Hollis Boyd looked at her and at the dry cuttings heaped beside the rig, and at the page shaking in her cold hand. And he was a man with a debt of his own, riding on this single hole, and a name he had spent 58 years building that he would not have laughed at. And he had every reason in the wide world to throttle the rig down for good, and pack up the mast, and call it a dry hole and drive home before dark. Move it where? He said.
Southeast, down the draw, 60 yards, maybe 80, to where the seal dips lowest.
She pointed down the shallow draw the way the land sloped and gathered, and she said the thing her grandfather had said to her 100 times at 100 fence lines in 100 cold trucks. Water goes to the low place. We drilled the high place. He'd have caught it in a second. He'd have caught it before we ever set the stake. Down the fence line, Dwight Crandall had stopped with his hand already on his truck door, watching them argue beside the dry hole, and the look on his face was not satisfaction anymore. It was something a great deal tighter than satisfaction. Hollis Boyd looked at the dry hole. He looked down the draw, and then slow, he looked back at the girl, and the corner of his mouth moved the same way it had moved once before in his shop over a cup of cold coffee.
Your granddad, he said, would have made a real nuisance of himself over a thing like this. He'd have brought another report, Etta said.
And Hollis Boyd laughed one short, rough bark of a laugh out there in the cold by the dead hole, and he climbed back up into the rig and began the slow, heavy work of moving it. And along the fence line, the men who had been climbing into their trucks stopped with their doors hanging half open and watched the rig crawl 60 yards down the draw to the southeast and lay out its mast and set up all over again on fresh ground. It took the better part of 2 hours to move the rig and set it and re-rig. Nobody left. Dwight Crandall did not leave either. He stood beside his clean truck with his arms crossed hard over his chest and watched every minute of it, and the longer he watched, the less he looked like a man waiting to be proven right. And the more he looked like a man watching the ground move under his own feet. At 309 feet, the bit broke clean through the bottom of the shale. The water did not roar. That would have made the story a great deal easier to tell in the years after, and a great deal less true. It came up instead, in a hard, clear surge that shivered all the way up the steel pipe and shook the whole rig and spilled over the lip of the casing and ran out across the cold ground. And Hollis Boyd killed the diesel, and in the sudden, enormous silence that fell, the only sound in all of Cimarron County was water. Cold, clear water coming up out of the dead Harlow ground under its own ancient pressure, running down the dry draw in a thin silver line through the dust. Not enough to irrigate a kingdom. Not enough to save every farm that had already failed in those hard years. But enough. 9 gallons a minute clear and cold rising on its own, with no pump and no power from a sealed bed 309 feet down that men had been driving their trucks over for 100 years and calling dead. Nobody spoke. Then the water kept coming, and it kept coming, and it did not stop, and a sound went up along the fence line that was not quite a cheer, because these were not cheering men by nature, but was something rougher and far more astonished than any cheer, the sound of grown men watching 40 years of their own dead. Certainty break open in front of them on a cold afternoon. Etta Sayer stood beside the casing with the mud of it on her boots and her grandfather's brass meter in one hand
and his letter in the other. And she did not move, and she did not cry, and she watched the water run out across the dead pond bottom that her grandfather had stood beside in his last living winters, knowing the whole entire time what lay beneath it, and could not bring himself to dig. "Make me right," he had written in a hand that shook. She had.
Hollis Boyd climbed down off the rig and came and stood beside her and watched the water run, and after a long while he said,
"Your old man would have made a nuisance of himself over this one."
"He'd have brought another report," Etta said, and her voice broke on it just slightly, the only time the whole day that it did.
Down the fence line, Dwight Crandall stood very still and watched the water rise and run, and then he turned and got into his clean truck and drove away, and the pale dust of him hung in the cold air a long time the way it had on the morning of the auction. But it meant something different now.
It was not over. Etta knew that even standing there in the first hour of the water with the mud on her boots, a man like Dwight Crandall did not lose a thing his family had held for 2 generations and simply drive home and let it lie. He came back 10 days later with a lawyer from the city. The claim they brought was a clever one, the way money is clever. They did not argue that the water wasn't there. They could not. It was running into stock tanks across 3 neighbors' grass by then cold and clear, and exactly as much as she had promised them at their kitchen tables. So instead, they argued the water itself. They argued through the smooth city lawyer that the confined sandstone bed Etta had tapped did not stop neat at the property line of Tract 4, that it ran on sealed and continuous under a good deal of the country to the south and east under Crandall ground. And they argued in careful language built to sound like nothing but plain fairness, that water drawn from a bed that lay mostly under Crandall land was in the part that truly mattered, Crandall water, and that the Sayer well was draining off what was rightfully theirs. It was the kind of argument that worked in that county when a Crandall was the one making it. It had worked for 2 generations. And the worst of it was that the bed truly did run on under their ground. That part was not a lie. The lawyer had the geology to show it, maps and cross-sections, all of it true. What the lawyer did not know, and what Dwight Crandall in all his certainty did not know, was that the bed running on under Crandall ground was not a danger to Etta Sayer at all. It was the last thing that turned the story, and it turned it all the way over. Because the proof that the confined bed ran continuous under the whole South Country, sealed and pressured and reachable, the very proof the Crandall lawyer now carried into a county courthouse to claim the water was the thing Silas Sayer had found in 1977 and logged in his own hand and been ruined for telling. The original finding, the one Burl Crandall had buried with a campaign of lies. The Crandalls had spent 40 years and a great deal of money making certain that finding
never once saw daylight, because if the county ever learned there was a continuous sealed bed of dependable water lying under all that dry south ground, every family pinned for 2 generations under the Crandall water rights would understand at once that they could drill their own way out from under them.
And now, to take one 15-year-old girl's single well, Dwight Crandall's own hired lawyer was standing up on his hind legs in a county courthouse in front of the whole county and proving with maps and geology and the state's own survey the exact thing his family had destroyed, a careful and decent man to keep hidden. He was proving the water was there, that it was real and continuous and reachable by any man with a rig. He was reading into the permanent public record the very finding that Burl Crandall had spent his life burying. Etta let him. She sat very still beside her mother and Hollis Boyd and old Aldous Petrie, and she let the Crandall lawyer prove that the bed ran on for miles. And then, when at last it was her turn, she did not argue the geology, because the geology was true, and it was hers. She did the one thing her grandfather had taught her to do above all other things. She brought the record. She brought the 1977 test hole log in Silas Sayer's own small, careful hand, dated and signed, proving that the water had been found and logged 14 full years before by a state surveyor doing public work on a public survey long before any Crandall claim to it now being made. She brought the state report with its pale blue cover. She brought the appendix table, and she let the court see in the careful small print her grandfather had taught her to read, all the way to the end, that the discovery the Crandalls now claimed for their very own had been made and recorded as public knowledge by a public servant a decade and a half before, and then quietly buried, and that the only reason on God's earth it had ever read uncertain in the official record was that the test hole had been set down on purpose in the wrong place. She did not stand up and accuse Burl Crandall, who was very old now, and did not come to the courthouse of anything she could not put a paper behind. She did not have to. She simply laid her grandfather's record down beside the Crandall lawyer's own bright maps, and she let the two of them agree with each other, the way the paper and the dirt had always agreed when an honest person read them honestly, and the agreement told the whole long story without her having to say one cruel word out loud in that crowded room. The water under Tract 4 was hers. The well was legal and it was good. The finding was public and it was old, and it was her grandfather's, and the Crandall claim to it collapsed flat under the weight of the very evidence they themselves had carried in to make it. And something else happened in that courthouse that day, something Etta had not planned for, and did not expect something that came in the end to matter to her far more than the water ever could. Burl Crandall had spent 40 years making Silas Sayer a joke in that county. The clipboard man, the poor old fool chasing water that wasn't there. And now the whole county packed shoulder to shoulder into that courthouse to see how the Sayer girls' strange fight came out, sat,
and watched the Crandalls' own expensive lawyer prove with maps and geology and the state's own survey seal that Silas Sayer had been right, that the careful man had found real water, dependable water, 14 years before any living soul believed it was down there, and had been ruined and made a joke for the simple crime of telling the truth about it. The record Etta laid down on that table did not just win her the well, it gave her grandfather his good name back. Men who had laughed at C. Sayer for 20 years sat in that courthouse and understood at last, all of them at once, that the joke had been the lie, and that the quiet, careful man had been right all along about all of it. Old Aldous Petrie wept openly, an old cattleman sitting in a county courtroom, crying into his big, rough hands and not caring one bit who in the world saw him do it. And Etta sat up very straight beside her mother and did not weep because she had done her weeping out beside the casing the afternoon the water came in. And this was not a day for weeping. This was a day for the record to be set right, finally, in front of everyone, the way her grandfather had wanted it set right, and had been too afraid in his lifetime to set it. She did not sell the quarter. That was the very first offer she turned down in the weeks after the courthouse, and there were others that came, and she turned every one of them down too. The water paid for itself, and then it paid for more than itself. The 3 prepaid leases turned into standing agreements, and then more neighbors came, the thirsty ones, the ones who had been opening Crandall gates with their hats in their hands their whole lives, and Etta Sayer leased them dependable stock water at a fair and honest price, well below what the Crandalls had charged the county for 2 full generations, and the hold the Crandalls had kept locked on the South Country began slowly, gate by gate, to come apart. Not all at once. The way real and lasting things come apart in this world. But it came apart, and it did not go back together. She paid Hollis Boyd first the way she had promised him she would in his shop, out of the very first water money, before she paid another living soul or another bill. She cleared the note in full. She fixed the fence around the west half with her own hands. And by the next spring, grass began to come back around the dead pond. Not miracle grass, not the green grass of a movie. Real grass, slow grass, the tough, rooted kind that takes hold a little at a time because water has finally come and changed what the soil is able to afford to risk. In 1994, she used 2 good seasons of water income to buy another failed quarter 5 miles east, and she read it for 6 months before she ever let a bit touch it. And that one did not flow up on its own the way the first one had, but it produced enough under a pump to make the lease work. In 1998, at 22 years old, she hung a hand-painted sign on the side of a small metal office she had put up beside the rebuilt Harlow windmill. Sayer Groundwater and Range. No slogan under it, just the name and a phone number. And the same men who had laughed at her in the auction tent began year by year to send their grown sons out to ask whether she would come look at a place before they bought it. The years passed, the way they do out on the plains. By drought, by calf prices, by hail in June and the slow failure of equipment, a man swore would last him one more season. Burl Crandall died an old man, and not many people went to the funeral, and fewer still stayed for the whole of it. Dwight Crandall sold off pieces of what his family had held for so long, and the gates that had stood locked for 2 generations began one by one to stand open, and the water that Silas Sayer had found and been ruined for ran at last freely to the families who had always needed it most. Royce Tanner retired in 2007. He was 78 by then, slowed by bad knees and a cough that stayed too long every winter. And one warm afternoon in late May, he drove out to Etta Sayer's office in an old white car that looked far too clean for the dirt roads it had come over. The dead pond was not dead anymore. The windmill had been rebuilt and turned bright in the wind, though she still ran the deep well underneath it. Cattle stood in the long shade of a pipe fence, and the grass, tough and rooted and real, ran out toward the country where the Crandall water used to be the only water there was. Etta came out of the office wiping ink from her fingers. She was 31 now. The weather had written itself into her face, the way it writes into the face of anyone who spends enough years listening to land instead of just standing on top of it and owning it. Royce Tanner stood beside his car with his hat held in both his hands. They talked a while the way men and women talk who have known the same dead about auctions long over and droughts long broken, and men who were gone now and the price of pipe. And then Royce looked out toward the place where the rented tent had stood 16 years before, though the tent had been gone almost as long as that, and he said the thing he had driven all the way out there to say. I owe you something. Etta waited, leaning on the pipe fence. That morning, when you bought this quarter. His voice was not steady the way it had been on the platform all those years ago, calling numbers like weather. I shook your hand after the sale because of Cy, not because of you. I heard the report number you gave me, and the depth, and the shale, all of it, and I still stood there thinking, maybe she's just a girl, repeating a thing she doesn't really understand. He turned his hat slow in his big hands. I've been sorry for that a long time now. Longer than you'd think. Etta looked out at the water for a moment. I was repeating him, she said. At first. Royce shook his head slowly. No, you were reading him. There's all the difference in the world between those two. And that was the truest thing anyone ever said about her in her whole life, and it had taken an old auctioneer 16 years to find the words for it. Before he left, he asked if he could see the water. She walked him out to the casing west of the pond. The flow was smaller now than it had been that first afternoon in 1991. The natural way these things settled down over the years, but it was still steady and still cold, and still rising up on its own, with no pump from a bed that most men had spent their whole lives flatly refusing to believe was down there at all. Royce Tanner bent down an old man with bad knees
and put 2 fingers into the running water. For a man who had spent 40 years listening to people shout across the front of a tent about what land was worth it was a strange thing for him to do, and a strange and quiet thing to stand and watch him do. He had spent his whole long life on the loud part of it, the part with the gavel. And here was the quiet truth of the whole thing running cold and clear over his old hand.
He stood back up and dried his fingers on a handkerchief and looked out at all the green that had come back to the dead ground. We all thought the auction was deciding the value, he said. Etta looked at the water running. The auction was only ever deciding who'd read the file. Royce Tanner laughed once, soft and tired, and it was the very same thing the salvage men and the cattlemen and the whole Laughing County had finally come around to understanding 16 years too late to laugh. That was the last time the two of them ever saw each other. After he died that next winter, Etta found a plain envelope waiting in her office mailbox. Inside it was Royce Tanner's old auction card from the Harlow sale, his own bidder card from that cold March morning, and on the back of it, in a hand gone shaky with age, he had written a single line. Number 18 knew the ground before the gavel did. She kept the card. She set it on the shelf above the cedar chest, beside her grandfather's worn brass meter and the yellow tablet, and still tucked behind the blank pages of the tablet where she had decided long ago to leave it the envelope with her own name written on the front, in his small, careful hand. The reports are all still there, more of them now than there ever were before. Soil maps and drilling logs and water tables, handwritten notes, photocopies grown so old the ink has gone soft and brown at the edges. And young ranchers come out by the office with sale bills folded up in their shirt pockets the way the county's sons have slowly learned to do, and Etta Sayer makes every one of them sit down at the kitchen table before she will ever once drive out to look at a piece of their ground. She makes them read the boring parts first. The appendix, the small print, the dull tables in the back, the lines that exist as far as most men are concerned, only so that no one will ever bother to read them. Because the story was never really about a girl getting lucky one cold morning at an auction. It was about a whole county full of people standing on top of an answer they had been too proud or too tired or too certain or too afraid to read. And about a careful man who found that answer and was ruined for it and buried it to protect the people he loved more than his own good name, and left it in the end to a granddaughter who turned out to be brave enough to dig it back up out of the dark. The water was never hidden because it was a secret. It was hidden because it was in the fine print, and because powerful men had a reason of their own to keep it there. And in the end, the land did not reward the loudest bidder, or the richest family, or the men who laughed in the tent. It rewarded the one who read the fine print all the way to the end.